In recent years, Britain has been at war. Not a war of words, but a hot war fought by armies mobilised to find and destroy the country's enemies. Thousands have been killed by bullets and bombs on both sides. And yet, even as Britain has sent its soldiers into the theatre of war, it has offered the hand of peace to its enemies at home. In Northern Ireland, the calling card of the British government was negotiation, not fighting. This led to one of the most successful accords in modern political history. By contrast, Britain and America did not even extend the chance of talks to the Taliban before the military onslaught began. Why this apparent contradiction? Is there a logic to these wildly different strategies? And do the public prefer purely military solutions or giving peace a chance first? These are the questions we put to the British public. Could they make sense of policies which, at first sight, appear to be at opposite ends of the political spectrum? We began by asking the public their view on why Britain refused to negotiate with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda before the military campaign began. Okay, why do you think Britain chose a military solution instead of negotiations in Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban?
Certain people, certain despots you can't negotiate with. Sometimes you can only rule by force. It's unfortunate, but sometimes it's a necessity, almost a necessary evil, if you will.
I don't think it was thought through at all. Still think that oil had a lot to do with it, and yeah, I think they thought of money first and fortune before the people, actually, and the civilians that were going to pay for it.
I think it's the special relationship with the US. Purely that.
Why do you think Britain chose to go to war with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda instead of negotiate with them?
I think it's got international pressure to do something, and we've got a rather sort of inflated idea of our place in the world. That's what I felt at the time. And I think it was done through pressure rather than a reasoned foreign policy, which we don't seem to have.
Naivety, don't know really. Could be lack of concern for other countries.
An interesting mix of answers. But is there a clear reason behind the UK's refusal to offer any negotiated settlement prior to a military conflict? We asked our experts.
Now, the reason that Britain did not negotiate with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, because what happened was in Afghanistan is that the whole thing was the response by the Americans and the British happened in response to the 9/11 attacks. Therefore, they felt that they had the overwhelming support by the international community at the time simply to bomb Taliban and to bomb Al-Qaeda and to get rid of the Al-Qaeda camps and the Al-Taliban, who were basically very well entrenched in Afghanistan at that time.
I attended a 2010 Afghan conference in London where I myself asked then Foreign Minister Mr. Miliband about that why Britain and the NATO forces are negotiating with Talibans and Pakistanis are not allowed to negotiate with the Taliban. And I think the way forward was the British troops were already having local agreements with the Taliban in Helmand province, where they had an agreement with not to attack each other. And that has been going on for a while. Similarly, Italian forces were doing the same thing when they were in Afghanistan. They were negotiating with local Taliban. And then the French forces as well, when there was a story in the time about these local forces or NATO forces negotiating with the local Taliban for not to attack them and paying them money.
Having established the reasoning for the refusal to negotiate abroad, we wondered if people had a view about why Britain did negotiate in Northern Ireland with paramilitaries instead of pursuing military methods. Here's what they said. In the same context, though, Britain did negotiate with the paramilitaries in Northern Ireland instead of having a military solution in the end. Why do you think they took a different view there?
I'd say because it was closer to the doorstep. It is something that was a bit more prominent. It's something that had been going on for longer. Like the Taliban's emergence is quite a new thing, and I think that probably in the future the government will end up having to negotiate with them.
Maybe their relationships was already there with Northern Ireland. maybe didn't have relationships with the Taliban like they did with Northern Ireland, maybe.
In the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, the government chose the opposite route. They negotiated with the paramilitaries instead of choosing a military solution. Why do you think they took the different approach?
Well, everybody wants to try and take the more peaceful approach initially, but as you can see how successful that was. So sometimes you have to try other routes. I mean, I'm always start with that route first, the more peaceful option, but you have to look at all options that are available.
That was nearer to home, wasn't it? And with all the bombings of the IRA, with Victoria bombing and everything, with all the just right next door to us, so I think they had to. They had no. And there's no oil there, is there? So what is there? What is there in Ireland really for the British government? Yeah. So because it was next door, thought they have to deal with it calmly.
Well, I think in that case, time played quite a long part. It took a long time. All the negotiations, getting them, not getting them, the IRA, all the problems in Ireland. The conflict's been going a long time. It has been going a long time in Afghanistan. But the thing in Afghanistan, it's been further away from England. The English should have learnt about Afghanistan if they went to the cathedral in not Faversham, Rochester Cathedral, and looked at the memorial there to the number of people got killed in the Afghan wars in the last century, or the century before last. And they might have had some idea of what they were up against. And I don't know if it was Kipling who said this, but you can never win a war against the tribespeople of Afghanistan. They make their own weapons. I don't know if they still do make their own weapons. They were the bigger arm makers in the world ever. And the idea that we could ever defeat them is completely mad. That's all I do know about the Afghan war.
Again, insightful answers from the public. Can our experts add more clarity?
Well, in Northern Ireland, it was a different issue, as Britain believes, and as the overwhelming majority in the country believe, that Northern Ireland is part and parcel of Britain. So it was an internal threat. And what they did is, over the long run, they actually infiltrated the IRA. It was until the IRA was brought to its knees by the infiltration, and also the campaign which the IRA accused Britain of actually supporting the organizations by the Unionists, which actually launched attacks within Northern Ireland to convince the IRA that their actions are futile in Northern Ireland. So when it comes to Northern Ireland, it was an internal issue.
Now, the Northern Ireland issue was very complicated, and it was going on for a long time. Since the European Union's legislation being implemented and enforced in the United Kingdom, especially the Human Rights Act coming into place in 1999 and 2000, which gave the greater authority to the European legislation and the local British legislation coming into force. And then the Northern Ireland issue was also linked with the terrorists in Maze prison and other British establishments. But having said that, the important question was that the Americans, the Irish Americans, had a very strong lobby, and that's why President Clinton and the other US presidents have been claiming some kind of link with the Irish heritage, and try to get the votes of the Irish people who are living in the United States. And those people who are in the US are very powerful and very strong. They kind of lobbied the US administration to ask the British government to find some kind of solution. Having said that, there are two groups in the real IRA and the other who are still fighting with the British troops, and there are still the incidents when large cache of arms and explosive have been discovered, although because they were not Muslims or from any Arab countries, they were not very much highlighted in the press.
Britain and the West did not try to negotiate with the Taliban, immediately taking a military approach. But what if things had been different? Do the public think that negotiations could have prevented a war in Afghanistan? Could negotiations have prevented the Afghanistan conflict, do you think?
That's a hell of a question.
Well, that's why I'm asking it.
I'd like to think that yes, it could have helped. It could have helped. I would have preferred to have seen it go down that road rather than through intervention through the military.
No. Afghanistan was and always will be probably a political mess for anybody except an Afghani.
But yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think if they'd have negotiated a deal before going straight in, I think
Could negotiations have prevented a war in Afghanistan?
Negotiations would have if we were capable of learning our own lessons from the past, particularly Afghanistan. Of all the nations in the world, Britain, probably Russia as well, because of the years, centuries ago we were fighting this question. If we had learnt the lessons of history, we might not have got into what we have got into. So I've always thought the foreign policy of this country has gone berserk and ill-informed for quite a few decades.
It's always a possibility, as one might say. Yeah, I mean, I prefer to exhaust all possibilities prior to putting people into military conflict.
Are the public correct? Or is it necessary to be willing to fight in order to secure peace?
Well, at the time, the answer from the Americans and also the British and their allies that we tried our best to convince the Taliban to hand over the leadership of Al-Qaeda. They didn't actually, if we look at it in a critical way, they didn't give negotiation enough time to actually try to resolve the issue, and they thought that, you know, the rest of the international community was well on their side, and they were within the right of trying to go after terrorism and the terrorist bases which were located in Afghanistan.
The US administration was kind of ruled by the arms dealers and military defense contractors who were in a hurry to attack a country which is already ruined and with no regular army, with no infrastructure in place, and they were able to bring in the equipment of heavy art equipment into Afghanistan, and kind of that has caused billions of dollars losses to the world as well as to the US economy.
Lurking in foreign policy, there is always the demon of vested interest. Who benefits most from a military approach? Do the public feel someone gained from not negotiating with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and if so, how? Do you think sometimes there's vested interest in these things? Do you think anyone gained from the military course instead of the negotiations course, and if so, in what way?
I'm sure that people gain from disasters all over the planet, all the time. People in the city and on Wall Street can get advantages through disaster. Who and why and how, it's not for me to say.
Who, if anyone, gained from the decision to go straight to war rather than to negotiate in Afghanistan?
Nobody.
Do you think there are people who stood to gain from a military solution instead of a negotiated one?
No, I don't think there's anybody thought in their right mind, especially in the military, thought there was going to be a solution. No one. Sorry, no one. Sorry about that, yes. I think, quite honestly, the military would have not gone near the place except for the politics of the situation. The ignorance of it all just got us back in it again. And as always, international pressure.
No, none at all. Again, this is far deeper than the roots are far deeper than just army and sending out your army out there. No.
Is there an expert explanation to the vested interests which might have influenced the decision to fight instead of negotiate?
Well, as far as the question of who actually were the main beneficiaries from not negotiating with the Taliban and also with Al-Qaeda are actually, in the long run, if we look at events now, since 2001 till now, Al-Qaeda has and the Taliban have benefited a great deal. They have bolstered their influence, they bolstered their image, they bolstered also for their stances and their standing in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. After, let's say, the longest war launched by America and its allies, we can safely say that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have emerged victorious.
US military defense contractors are the main beneficiaries of the two wars. They didn't let the civilian administrations in both in Pakistan, Afghanistan and the United States to come up with some kind of an environment where they can pinpoint the real culprits behind these terrorist incidents. Instead, they kind of promoted a culture of paranoia and fear, and they were keep on producing the security equipment and the arms equipment, the drones and the bombs. I mean, it's like you're throwing a 50,000 pounds bomb on a $100 tent, and then the plane is about maybe 500 million pounds plane. Now this is kind of involvement of money into this whole war. It was too much for the defense contractor to pull back.
At the end of the day, politicians are there to serve the best interests of the public. But do the public feel they have benefited or suffered because Britain did not negotiate with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? Do you think that overall Britain has benefited or suffered as a result of the decision to go to war instead of to attempt a negotiation?
Suffered.
Why is that?
It's been a huge cost. It's done a lot for Islamophobia. It's been detrimental to our society, I'd say.
They could have been a bit more stronger and not listened to America, not just gone in with America. They could have stood up for their own beliefs rather than following other countries because of whatever happened.
Do you think Britain, for example, has been helped or harmed by the decision to pursue military conflict instead of negotiations?
Well, again, I mean, that's one of those things I'm not really necessarily sure that I'm prepared to answer. I like to think that they were helped, but really I think it's only certain individuals that were benefited economically. As a populace, I believe that Great Britain really we're spending a lot of money in order to pay for the military action, and what is the actual gains to be had from individuals themselves? Probably not much.
We've suffered because there were all those soldiers who lost their lives, and all their families are still suffering and will suffer forevermore. So it was a useless waste of time and young blood, young soldiers.
The views of the public are thus very varied. Do our experts have a clearer opinion, or is this matter too complex and uncertain?
I mean, at the end of the day, we've seen the US trying to negotiate with the Taliban after a long war, which has cost both the US and also Britain in terms of the fatalities or losing its soldiers in a war in Afghanistan, along the longest war, and also in terms of the financial losses, which have had a detrimental impact in the economy in both the US and also in Britain, because a lot of money could have been spent dealing with major financial problems within Britain and also within USA. All those finances has been directed to prop up and to continue a war which is absolutely futile.
Now the losses Britain suffered to the economy is enormous. Now this whole losses to the NHS, for example, and the public sector, and these cuts are too big to handle. I mean, that money could have been spent for education, health, and other poverty alleviation projects within the United Kingdom, which never happened.
Our last question is one of principle, about how British politicians sometimes support negotiations and at other times choose war. We asked the public if there were any policies which can never be compromised or negotiated away. Are there any principles so strong that you simply should never negotiate or compromise on them?
I think that there's always a route through dialogue. There's always something that you can negotiate. There's always some way that you can benefit through dialogue rather than through intervention.
Well, if you get an intransigent government, as Margaret Thatcher was, yes, it is impossible. But then you realise intransigence sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Again, history judges that, and I think a good politician judges that as well.
I believe if someone's attacking you, then you attack back, but you don't never attack someone for no reason. That's what I believe. So, no.
Are there any circumstances where it is impossible to negotiate and it's just the right thing to go for a military solution first?
No, I disagree totally. Every situation has an answer outside violence and military action. Everyone.
Never. I do not believe in any war at all. We don't have the sort of politicians who can negotiate anymore. The current politicians are in for themselves.
We invited comments on the question from our experts.
Such negotiations actually never taken place. The Americans were pushing for such negotiation in preparation for them leaving to prepare the ground and pave the way for an American withdrawal and also a British withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2014 in order to shore up the Karzai government in Afghanistan and to actually pull the rug from under the feet of the Taliban. Those negotiations have not taken place, and I do believe that the negotiations with Al-Qaeda have not taken place, although the West, and saying led by the Americans, would have actually loved to have such negotiations in order to say when they leave from Afghanistan that, you know, their experience or the military campaign launched in Afghanistan was a success.
Well, I think Britain hasn't not put any precondition to the negotiations with the Taliban, because obviously it is a closure time. They've been there for more than 10 years, and it is causing a lot of economic pressure on the British economy, as well as the regional players have been changed in the region. They need to negotiate with the local players as soon as possible, and the chances that the same people are going to come back into power, i.e. Taliban or their representative might come back, because we can't change the culture. So I think there could be a mixed match of democracy and the local tradition, cultural system could be amalgamated and maybe bring into something of a nature which can work for everyone, the international community as well as the local Afghanis, who can have a peace after maybe 35 years of this war and destruction and death in their country.
Over the last 4 decades, Britain's approach to quite similar issues has swung dramatically between negotiations and immediate war. Even during the peace talks in Northern Ireland, British troops were ordered to march into war in Afghanistan with no prior offer of talks. Are foreign terrorists so different to homegrown rebel movements? Is it because in Northern Ireland the terrorist groupings had British roots and a Christian faith, while abroad they had non-British roots and a Muslim faith? It is hard to see any other cause behind the decision of policymakers in Kabul to forget the lessons of Belfast and enter a shooting war without even offering a war of words. History proves time and again that shooting first and asking questions later is not a policy of peace, but a recipe for war, and one which policymakers in the West have once again doomed us all to relive.